Okay, this is going to be your first lecture on the epithelial tissue. This is a combination of both lecture and lab. So different from other sections where I usually separate the lecture portion and the lab portion. Instead, what I'm doing with the histology is I am separating epithelial tissue from all the rest of the tissues. And so this has a combination of both your lecture portion and your lab portion for just half of the material of the chapter. Right, so let's start with talking about what a tissue is. And so a tissue is going to be a collection of cells of the same type that perform a common function. And what this means is essentially a tissue is a bunch of cells together that are all doing the same type of thing. They're all working towards the same type of thing. So for instance, they may all be trying to work together to make support and protection. For instance, you can think of like bones supporting your body. They can be working together to protect things from going in or out of the body, so as part of your skin. And so that's usually a type of epithelial tissue there. So what we're specifically looking at is tissues, these clusters of cells that are going to do specific things. So for instance, in nervous tissue, you can have a bunch of cells together that are performing the function of delivering messages. Or you can have a bunch of cells together that are doing the performing movement. So that would be your muscle tissue. There are 4 classic types of tissue in the human body, and these are going to be connective, muscle, epithelial, and nervous tissue. Right? For this first portion, we are specifically looking at the epithelial tissue. And then next week, you'll be looking at connective muscle and nervous tissue. Okay, so let's start with what makes epithelial tissue epithelial tissue. Well, epithelial tissue is going to be those cells that work together to do any of these following functions. And that can be to line body surface and cavities. So if you think, for instance, of your stomach, inside the body, your stomach is going to be lined by a specific type of tissue called epithelial tissue. So what is lining this stomach here is all going to be epithelial tissue. What is lining the esophagus is going to be epithelial tissue. What is lining those intestines is going to be your epithelial tissue. What is lining the anus is going to be epithelial tissue. What is lining your throat and your mouth is epithelial tissue. So it lines those body surfaces and cavities. It's also going to be the major type of tissue you're going to find in glands. So glands are going to be groups of cells that are going to perform a specific type of function. So for instance, you have sweat glands, you have mammary glands, you have glands that produce hormones or other types of things. And those glands are going to be made specifically out of a type of epithelial tissue. And we'll see which type of epithelial tissue that is. Some classic characteristics of epithelial tissue, they're avascular. So what does avascular mean? Whenever you see the prefix A, that means that is the opposite, or it's null, or like the word no. Vascular means like blood supply. So this has no blood supply. It's non-vascular. Avascular means non-vascular, no direct blood supply. So epithelial tissue does not have its own blood vessels, but it does have some underlying tissue which will help to provide it with a blood supply. And we'll look at what that means. The other key characteristic of epithelial tissue is that they reproduce rapidly, which means they can break down quickly, but they can also replace themselves fairly quickly. And this makes sense because if you line body surfaces and cavities, then those things are going to be open or more, I shouldn't say open, they're going to be more freely able to be damaged or worn down. And so then they need to easily be replaced to replenish. So your stomach lining is made out of epithelial tissue. As you learned from your pH, stomach acid is very, very acidic, which means that it's going to be wearing down those cells of the stomach lining a lot. That's very common. So you need to be able to replace those cells to make sure that you have constant good lining of your stomach. The your skin is an organ, so it's made out of different types of tissue. But if you were to look at your skin going from the external downwards, your skin is actually going to have the external layer, and then it's going to have many layers within it. This external layer is going to be made solely out of epithelial tissue. Okay. And that epithelial tissue, of course, is going to constantly be worn down because you're going to have abrasion happening on it. Every time you touch something, every time you scrape your skin, every time your clothes touch your skin, any little thing is going to be wearing down skin cells. And so they need to be able to reproduce rapidly. And the last thing is that they're going to, in many cases, or they're going to tend to be packed in a form that is continuous sheets. So they're going to be adjacent cells bound by junctions. So if you remember that cells can have junctions that help hold them together. And that's what we're having here. These epithelial cells will be packed closely together. So they're going to have many junctions holding them together. Depending on what type of epithelial tissue it is, they can be held very, very close together with tight junctions, or they can be held together with junctions that are going to be less tight. What are the functions of epithelial tissue? Well, they provide physical protection, because if you think that they're going to line body surfaces and organs, then they need to protect those body surfaces and organs. They're also going to control permeability. So especially in the case we have tight junctions, they're going to keep things from seeping out and things from seeping into the body. It's going to provide sensation. So a key thing is, even though it blinds and protects, right, all of those body organs, it also needs to have sensation so that you know if something is affecting it. And it's going to have specialized secretions. Remember that we just mentioned in the previous one that glands are made out of epithelial tissue, and glands secrete things like sweat glands secrete sweat. Your mammary glands are going to secrete milk. So glands secrete specific things. Also, your epithelial tissue can secrete other things, like in the skin, it can help secrete sweat through the sweat glands. It can secrete mucus. So for instance, in your esophagus, okay, you're going to, and throughout your intestines, you are going to have your esophagus and intestines covered, that internal lining, by epithelial tissue, but it needs to be very moist area so that it can help pass down the food easily. And so these epithelial tissue here are going to secrete a type of mucus. So mucus is a secretion produced by epithelial tissue throughout your digestive tract. All right, so let's look at some key features of the epithelial tissue. And these are common things that epithelial tissue will have. So all epithelial tissue is going to have an apical surface, and all epithelial tissue will have a basal surface. So this is common for epithelial tissue. They're going to have a basal surface, also known as your basement membrane. And this is the bottom layer that's going to be attached to an underlying type of tissue. And then it's going to have an apical surface, which is the surface, the side that is lining your free area. So there's nothing here. This is all free space around here. So this one is attached to an underlying tissue, usually connective tissue. And this one's going to be free surface, right? Do not say top and bottom, because it can be facing any which way. So if you think about the inner lining of the small intestine, if this is your stomach, and then you have your small intestine lines here, right? Okay. Then if we're looking at an epithelial tissue right here lining the small intestine, the apical surface is going to be the free space here, right here. Be the apical surface, but the basement surface will be here. So it's not really a top-bottom type of thing. Cilia and microvilli will only be found on some types of epithelial tissue. Only on some types of epithelial tissue. Cilia are going to be extensions, like you see in this image here, that come off of the epithelial tissue. And basically what they do is they help move things or filter things. So cilia is commonly found in your respiratory tract because the epithelial tissue that is lining your respiratory tract needs to help remove any possible pathogens from getting into your lungs. So through your nose, through part of your through your nose, through your larynx, and through your trachea, you're going to find a lot of cilia helping to remove pathogens. Microvilli, which are also found on the apical surface, but only of certain cells, they can be found in the cells like in your intestine, where they are going to do a lot of digestion or absorption, I should say. So these help absorb nutrients. So they help bring nutrients into the body. So when you have food going through your body, your stomach will start to break it down, your intestines will continue breaking down, and then they're also going to absorb, obtain, bring into the body all the nutrients that it needs to bring in. And that's where the microvilli comes in handy. All right. Here we're going to talk about how epithelial tissue is named. So all epithelial tissue, please note, all epithelial tissue has at least 2 names. Okay? All epithelial tissue has at least 2 names. They are never going to have just one name. And those names are going to be given in 2 ways. The first name, so this is like your first name, is going to be by number of cell layers. Your second name or your last name is going to be by the shape. So this would be the last name. I'm sorry. The last name is by shape. Okay, so the first name is given by how many layers you are. If you're 1 layer thick, you're called simple. If you're 2 layers thick, you're called stratified. Your last name is given by the shape of your cell. If your cell looks flat and thin, like we see here in this image, see, this is 1 cell here. From here through here is 1 cell. And it's flat and thin. And you can see how it kind of looks like a little fried egg. Then you are called squamous because this cell looks squished down. Squish, S-Q-U, right? It looks squished. So squishy, squamous, S-Q-U, S-Q-U. Okay, the cuboidal cell is this one here, the second cell you see in the image, and you can see how it looks like a nice little cube with a perfectly round nucleus. Then this one looks like a cube, so it's cuboidal because it looks like a cube. The columnar looks just like that. It looks like a column. You have an entire column thick with an elongated nuclei. Because it's not column shaped, it's columnar. If I am 1 layer thick of column cells, then I am called simple columnar. 1 layer of column cells. If I am, like in the example here, multiple layers of cuboidal shaped cells, then I am stratified, which means multiple layer. Cuboidal, because my cells look cube-shaped. Remember, all epithelial tissue will have 2 names. So you're never just going to be cuboidal. You're never going to be just squamous. You're never going to be just stratified. You would be simple squamous or stratified squamous, simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, simple columnar, stratified columnar. The last type is a unique one, which is pseudostratified. And pseudostratified means, the word pseudo means fake, and stratified is multiple layers. So this is actually a fake multiple layers. Pseudostratified tissue is actually only 1 layer thick, but it looks like it's multiple layers. And we're going to look at this. There's only 1 type of pseudostratified epithelial tissue you need to know for your exam. And so we're going to look at what it actually looks like and how you can differentiate it from all the rest you just went over. I'm going to pause the video here, and your second lecture video is then going to look at your different types of epithelial tissue. So now that you understand how epithelial tissue functions, what are its functions, what are some common features of it, that it has an apical layer and a basal layer, that you understand how it's being named, that always has at least two names, by the type of shape and by the number of cell layers. And in the next video, we're going to look at those different types of tissue and how to be able to identify those types of tissue.